So James Mackintosh is a historic figure, relatively well recognized. To most people, Mackintosh is one of the key participants of the pamphlet war initiated by Edmund Burke. Then he's known for his ideological conversion that led him to lose the position of the adherent and became an enemy of the French Revolution. And finally, he's enumerated among the leading Whigs of the early 19th century. And all these characteristics of Mackintosh are true, but they are not fully revealing his quite unique career. When you visit Westminster Abbey and when you find Mackintosh's sculpture, you can read an inscription founded by Mackintosh's nephew, Claude Erskine, in 1867. You will read there, "To the memory of Sir James Mackintosh, jurist, philosopher, historian, and statesman." At first sight, it is surprising that Mackintosh is described primarily as a jurist. But closer analysis of his biography proves that the pivotal part of his career indeed was law involved. Born in Scotland and educated in Aberdeen and Edinburgh, Mackintosh was trained as a skilled physician who wanted to raise his qualifications in London. When he arrived there, however, he became much more absorbed in the great politics. He attempted to become a journalist, but eventually he finished rather as a lawyer. On the 28th of April 1790, he was admitted to the Lincoln's Inn, and 5 years later, he was called to the bar. In the following years, he was working as a barrister with rather moderate success. To improve the standard of his and his family life, Mackintosh tried to find a permanent and more valuable source of income. In his opinion, a good option would be the appointment to the office of the colonial judge. After several attempts that included a judgeship in Trinidad, he was finally appointed a judge in Bombay. He spent there several years acting, or at least wanting to be, a leading intellectual of the colonial town. After several years spent in India, Mackintosh returned to England in 1811 with quite great relief. Since 1813 until his death in 1832, Mackintosh was an active member of Parliament. In the opinion of some contemporary observers even, he was close to becoming a prime minister. Instead of this, in 1818, he was appointed Professor of Law and Politics at East India Company College in Hailbury, where he replaced Edward Christian, the first Downing Professor of Laws of England at Cambridge. Regarding the subject of my paper today, we shall focus on Mackintosh's early career as a barrister. As mentioned already, in 1795, Mackintosh was called to the bar at Lincoln's Inn. It is possible to wonder to what extent daily activity as a barrister was appropriate due to Mackintosh's mentality and daily way of being. Despite the practicality of the studies that he had undertaken back in Edinburgh and later in the inns in London, Mackintosh was deeply convinced about his intellectual as well as writing responsibilities. Reading of his private documents, especially diaries edited by his son, Robert James, shows how much Mackintosh wanted to teach others and how much he wanted to enlighten his readers, listeners, or even participants of the court proceedings when he was judged back in India. On 30th of January 1798, the governing body of Lincoln's Inn responded to Mackintosh's former request to initiate within the inn a course of lectures that would be devoted to the problems of the law of nature and the law of nations. Mackintosh's request was quite special, but not entirely novel. It is true that the former teaching in the Inns of Court, that was an obligatory one in the earlier centuries, disappeared almost entirely during the later part of the 17th and through the entire 18th centuries. Although the so-called readers were officially appointed every term, their activity was rather limited. This was true not only for Lincoln's Inn, but for all Inns of Court. In 1796, however, this gap was filled by the course of lectures delivered to the members of the Lincoln Inn by Michael Nolan, another member of that inn. Nolan, who was born in Ireland, was practicing first as an attorney at the Irish Court of Exchequer, and in 1792 he was called to the English bar. In 1796, he delivered his English law lectures, whereas their outline was published under the title A Syllabus of a Course of Lectures. They were loosely based on a scheme that resembled the works of Matthew Hale and William Blackstone. But as it seems that Nolan wanted to make the lectures more acquainted to his audience and more up-to-date. According to the entry in the Lincoln's Inn Black Book, Mackintosh wanted to give lectures on the laws of nature and nations because these subjects were until now only discussed by scholars who were hoping to obtain a doctorate degree in civil law at the universities. In the printed version of the introductory lecture published under the title A Discourse on the Study of the Law of Nature and Nations, Mackintosh also admitted that his initiative was closely related to that of Nolan. Mackintosh proclaimed, "A learned gentleman, however, had already occupied that ground and will, I doubt not, persevere in the useful labour which he has undertaken. On his province it was far from my wish to intrude. It appealed to me that a course of lectures on another subject closely connected with all liberal professional studies, and which had long been the subject of my own reading and reflection, might not only prove a most useful introduction to the law of England, but might also become an interesting part of general study and an important branch of the education of those who are not destined for the profession of the law." It is true that Mackintosh's initiative was unique. It must be remembered, however, that not everyone was in favour of Mackintosh at the time. Although Lincoln's Inn agreed to organise the lectures, Mackintosh himself noted, as preserved in the memoirs edited by his son, that the indecision was not safe from the very beginning. Mackintosh wrote, "Some were alarmed at the idea of lectures on the principle of law necessarily involving in a certain degree the principles of politics, being delivered by the author of some of the sentiments of the Vindice Gallica." Now, the Vindice Gallica was a pamphlet written by Mackintosh in 1791 in defense of the French Revolution. Although Mackintosh later converted and was now a supporter of Burke's views, many still remembered his initial admiration for the revolutionary cause in France. Among those who supported Mackintosh and pleaded in his favour was the Prime Minister and member of the Lincoln's Inn, William Pitt. According to Robert James Mackintosh, an additional reason behind his father's decision to offer the course of lectures to the Inn was the hope of throwing off the shade of supporting the French Revolution. When the Inn decision was secured, Mackintosh started to prepare his course. Our current knowledge of the organisation of the course can be based on three separate sources. First, the published version of the introductory lecture. Secondly, information gathered by his son and published in the Memoirs of the Life in 1835. And three, the original Mackintosh's manuscript, now owned by the British Library. I have to explain that for the purpose of this paper, I have limited myself to the first two sources. Unfortunately, I still await the scans from the British Library, and according to the authorities of the library, the current pandemic situation has enormous impact on the number of scans that the British Library is asked to prepare, and unfortunately I didn't receive them in the proper time. The actual course of lectures was delivered by Mackintosh from February to June 1799, and he delivered it again between January and March 1800, when some changes, especially regarding his stronger condemnation of the French Revolution. It is interesting that between the first and second series of lectures, Mackintosh decided to travel to Cambridge, where he spent several weeks. During these weeks, he was rewriting some of his lectures, and he was reading new works that were not available to him in London. And most plausibly, the manuscripts that the British Library possess are the manuscripts of the notes made by Mackintosh during his stay in Cambridge. The course consisted of 39 lectures. Due to the non-academic character of the audience, which was largely professional, Mackintosh was forced to adjust his lectures to the needs of the barristers. For this reason, he was obliged to suspend the lectures by the assizes and quarter sessions. Although it was organized at Lincoln's Inn, it was not conceived as an old-style reading for members of the inn. It was described as a public lecture and was such public lecture. The audience of Mackintosh's lecture consisted of, quote, lawyers, members of parliament, men of letters, and country gentlemen who crowded to hear him. This statement may be a bit of an exaggeration. It is hard to believe that all these people attended every lecture, but even if they attended some or even the first one only, it well illustrates the resonance of Lincoln's indecision to organize such a course of lectures at the end of the 18th century. The comparison between the introductory lecture and the excerpts of the lectures preserved in the memoirs sheds light on two different aspects of Mackintosh's course. Although the introductory lecture was mostly legal, the excerpts are much more philosophical. The introductory essay, published subsequently in two editions in 1798 and in 1799, was 68 pages long. It was not divided into any smaller editorial units, but rather published as one long lecture. Nevertheless, some main threads can be enumerated. Explanation of the subject of the lecture, the law of nature in relation to individuals as well as to the states, and the development of the doctrine of the law of nature from ancient times until modern. The final part of the printed version of the lecture was in fact a critique of the doctrine of the law of nations developed by Grotius. Mackintosh posited a new system of the law of nations in opposition to the doctrinal achievements of Grotius and Pufendorf. In his opinion, the initiative was important because the international political situation had changed since the times of Grotius and Pufendorf. In this part of the printed lecture, Mackintosh described some pivotal problems of international relations, the law of war, diplomatic law, or the law of treaties. He also devoted some of his attention to constitutional problems such as the relationship between the citizen and the state, the political system, and the power of government. He also mentioned some general rules reflecting on private and criminal law. An interesting observation was made by Mackintosh in relation to the origins of the law of nations. He presented his own interpretation of the development of that branch of jurisprudence. He stated that the law of nations was not influenced by the concept that had been collected in Justinian's codification and later resurfaced in medieval times. The law of nations developed, in his opinion, only because of the 16th century research on Roman law and the in-depth study of Roman history and literature. In his opinion, the Mos Gallicus was the true source of the law of nations. He provided his readers with references to key representatives of the tradition, Cujacius, Brisson, and Othman. Regarding the excerpts from the lectures that can be found in the memoirs, Robert James decided to present a much different outline of his father's lectures. As mentioned already, the lectures seem to be much more philosophical. Considering Mackintosh's general interest, this seems plausible and right. He supposedly focused on the concept of property and marriage, which, in his opinion, were the most focal points of any religious or philosophical system, as well as any civil or criminal code. Mackintosh was hostile to the idea of classical education offered in England. He believed that too much time and labor are employed in the study of the languages of Greece and Rome. Simultaneously, he thought that ancient examples can be especially useful for modern life. For him, for instance, one of the most vital benefits of ancient learning for modern people should be a relation between classical learning and morality. He also described the experience of ancient people as noble studies, and in his opinion, they are part of an unbroken chain of learning which unites the most remote generations. Mackintosh found that the strength of the ancient solutions lay in their repetition in the following centuries. In his opinion, the moral structures laid in the Ten Commandments, the whole Pentateuch, and the Indian laws of Manu are carriers of the same values, values that did not change until modern times. Mackintosh proclaimed, "The fact is evident that no improvements have been made in practical morality." What made the lecturing attempt undertaken by Mackintosh tell us about legal education in the late 18th century? I think to answer this question, it is necessary to explain one thing. Even if Mackintosh wanted to throw off the shade of his former support of the French Revolution, it should not take away from our sight a tool that he had chosen. Being a more or less public figure allowed him to make some form of public statement or to publish a new book or pamphlet on the subject. Instead of this, he wanted to make an impression and to convince people to him through the means of the public lecture. What I mean here is that the tool itself was rather significant and it fits into the specificity of the epoch. Linking his lectures with the earlier lectures of Nolan is thoughtful and intentional. Despite the assurance regarding the redemption of his thought, I think that Mackintosh was indeed willing to teach. This is part of who he was and how he perceived the people with whom he came into contact. Another matter is the success, or rather lack of it, of the course. David Lemmings, in his book Professors of the Law, Barristers and English Legal Culture in the 18th Century, wrote, "None of these lecture courses was likely to succeed, because unlike the traditional exercises and readings, they were not integrated with the probationary regulations for the bar and could not be supported by the INS, impoverished corporate life." And I have to agree with that statement. Both Nolan's and Mackintosh's courses were not integrated with traditional forms of educating young lawyers in the INS. I believe, however, that Mackintosh, I'm not sure about Nolan, was far from doing something traditional. He wanted to teach law, and I think this was most unique. He wanted to do this publicly, and he wanted to reach as many people as possible. In fact, I doubt that he was hoping to convince average lawyers of his philosophical ideas. What he was trying to do, I think, was to illuminate the society as such, the same as he was later doing in his writings, public readings in India, judicial directives in Bombay, or finally in his parliamentary speeches. Thank you very much.